Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I'm the founder and president of Ubiquity University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next lecture on our great books series, where I am contemplating two of the biographies offered by Plutarch. Last month, we considered Alcibiades, the Athenian who led the Athenians to ruin. And today we're going to be contemplating the Roman general Sulla, who really broke the back of the Roman Republic. We do this because we are contemplating the rise and presidency of Donald Trump, who I consider a dangerous threat to the constitutional republic of the United States of America, and who I think we can understand more deeply through what the historian Barbara Tuchman called a distant mirror, holding up a mirror from the ancient past, where strong men rose within the context of crisis, social polarization, growing disparity between the rich and the poor, the fragility of law, the delicacy of constitutional systems, and literally broke the system down, from which it never recovered. And that's, I think, the first point that I wanted to make today as I sit in my Airbnb in Chartres, France, and having come out of a beautiful, beautiful summer of courses. For those of you who know our Chartres Academy and the Wisdom School, go on our website and to the YouTube channel where you can get some of our Chartres community calls. And in the beauty and serenity of Chartres Cathedral, I've been contemplating the decline and fall of the American Republic. And the first point that I want to make is that it's always easy to assume that our laws are strong and that phenomena like a Donald Trump are aberrations in the system, and that when he's gone, everything is going to go back to normal. What I want to submit to all of us for our consideration today is that that happy ending almost never happens. Acts have consequences. And if Donald Trump is not stopped soon and definitively, the Republic of the United States will be forfeit. And that will have consequences not only for American history, but for global history, because we're just coming out of the American century in global affairs, and therefore the collapse of the American Republic will reverberate quite literally around the world. And it is quite possible that it will be recorded that Donald Trump killed it. And we need to take that in, particularly at a time when the Democratic Party, under the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, seems both unwilling and incapable even to do something as obvious as impeaching the president. We need to reflect very deeply that Naomi Klein, in her book, No Is Not Enough, was making a profound point that Trump is not an exception to American history. He is the exemplification of the end of American democracy. And that what he represents is the rot of late stage monopoly capitalism, as Karl Marx would have put it, and the satiation that begins to infect any imperial system, if you've read your Arnold Toynbee. And remember what Toynbee said is that empires, civilizations aren't killed, they commit suicide. And I believe that what we're witnessing with the Donald Trump presidency is the suicide of the American Republic. And only if we take this prospect seriously will we take the actions necessary to save the Republic and potentially save the world. Because at the heart of the savagery and the criminality of Donald Trump is his refusal to acknowledge that climate change is a reality. Just yesterday, he blew off the climate change summit at the G7 in Paris, saying that he thought it was later. And that then he changed his story and said, well, he was actually meeting with the leaders of Germany and India. And on the news today, they showed the leaders of Germany and India in the climate change summit. So that kind of erratic behavior is what suicide is about at its deepest level. So I would like to contemplate for a few moments today the life and career of Sulla. Born in 138 BC, died in 78 BC, and his life, like Trump's, spanned the final crisis of the Republic and the transition of the Republic into coercion administered by a strongman in a dictatorship that was complete. And the strategy was a strategy of fratricide, and the end result was a result of violence. We all know the mythology of Rome. It is said that Rome was founded actually on April 21st, 753, by Romulus and Remus, but Romulus very quickly killed off Remus. And so fratricide, just parenthetically, was at the heart of the founding of Rome. Fratricide was also at the heart of the founding of America. That's the slaves. And that's the way we treated our indigenous peoples. So right at the heart of the American genesis, as with Rome, was an act of coercive violence and fratricide. Let us remember that. 100 years after the birth of the United States, a civil war of unparalleled savagery rent the land. And what Donald Trump is resurrecting in the American psyche now are all the reasons why that war was fought: racism, sexism, exploitation, fear of the foreigner. Rome initially was founded as a monarchy. Romulus ruled as king. And king succeeded king, and the Romans, like the Americans, were in perpetual war. Rome, from the very first day almost, was at war. So is the United States. The United States has fought several hundred wars over the last 250 years. It's been in a perpetual state of war, like Rome was. The parallels are very striking. Then toward the end of the 6th century BC, in the year 509, there was an incident where the king at the time, a man named Tarquin, who had a son named Sextus, both were violent in temperament, arrogant by disposition, exploitative by policy, began to rule so imperiously that the Roman populace began to groan. And then one day, the son Sextus, with his drinking colleagues, in a tent near the fields of one of the battles that they were fighting, began to talk about the women of Rome and how all the women were easy prey. One of the soldiers that was there, Carminides, said, "Not my wife. My wife, Lucretia, is a true noble woman of Rome." And Sextus said, "We'll see." And with a group, he rode to the house where Lucretia was staying, living, burst into the door, and he found her with her maidens sewing a sweater for her husband. And so outraged was Sextus that the next night he broke in, and at sword point, he said to Lucretia, "You either succumb to me, or I'm going to kill you, kill your slave, put your bodies together, and tell everyone you were unfaithful to your husband." Lucretia, having pity on her slave, gave herself to Sextus. And the next day, she went to her father and said to her father, "This is what happened." And before her father could do anything, took a knife and committed suicide. When news of this outrage got to the populace with one accord, they rose up and killed the king and his son. And the Tarquins were banished. And in its place, they established a republic. And it was one of the earliest experiments in democracy in the ancient world. Athens had a direct democracy. The people of Athens voted directly. The Romans experimented with a republic. That's virtually every democracy in the world followed the Roman model, where you elect representatives that make the decisions. There were councils, there were magistrates. And initially, they were voted in by a senate comprised of the patrician class, the aristocracy, the ancient families of Rome. Over the next 100 years, there began to be revolts, like in every democracy, as more and more people demanded a share of the democratic pie. And there began to emerge in the Roman Republic the optimi, the aristocrats, and the plebeians, the popularity, the masses. And that distinction, which is played out between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, between the conservatives and labor, those who honor the tradition want less democracy, and those that want more democracy to help the poor and the outcast. That basic dynamic is played out in almost every democratic society in the world. Rome then conquered Italy. And there was a challenge, well, what do you do with the conquered people? The conquered people wanted to be Roman citizens. And that began to fester in the Republic. Then in the 3rd century, Rome fought Carthage for control of Sicily and the Mediterranean. You remember the story of Hannibal in 212 to 203, coming across the Alps down into northern Italy and laying siege to Rome. And for 6 years, maneuvered around the Italian peninsula until he was finally defeated by Scipio Africanus, having had to return to Carthage. On the strength of that victory, Rome conquered Greece. In 167, 168, came down into what is now Syria and Palestine. And all that wealth began to come back to Italy. Italy became flooded with slaves. What do you do with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of slaves? The population of Rome began to swell. How do you handle wealth? Well, the patrician class said, we'll handle it. And they began to buy up more and more land in Italy, throw off the farmers, and deploy the slaves. Where did the farmers go? They went to Rome. Penniless, alienated, unsure of the future. And it was in the midst of all this contradiction that Sulla was born in 138 BC. And while he was a teenager, there was what they call the Revolt of the Gracchi brothers. First Tiberius and then Gaius Gracchus, who were in the Senate. And they said, we've got to cap how much land we own, because it's causing such massive civil unrest that we're going to have civil war. But the conservative senators said no. And when it was all over, first Tiberius, with 3,000 of his followers, were massacred. And then Gaius tried, and he was killed. And polarization and hatred, class division, massive corruption began to embody the Roman Republic, just like the United States today. And there arose a general named Marius. And Marius was a brilliant general. He fought many of the armies of Rome. And he began to reform the Roman army reformed it into phalanxes, professionalized the weaponry, and instituted a reform that made the general, rather than the republic, the source of loyalty for the soldiers. Because he, along with the patricians, after a battle, would begin to reward his soldiers unilaterally with money and land. So for the first time, the military was not aligned with the republic, with the state, but with the general. There was a revolt in North Africa under a Numidian king named Jugurtha. And he chose the young Sulla, a young man who was given to debauchery and drink and cavorting with artisans and musicians of all kinds, but who was brilliant, well-educated, and strategically a genius. And he took Sulla with him to North Africa. And the war had been dragging on for 5 years. The Romans couldn't figure out how to beat the Numidians. Sulla arranged for the brother of Jugurtha to betray him. And thus the battle was won. But when Marius went back to Rome, he claimed all the credit. And Sulla was ousted. Marius was a champion of the populari, the masses, the soldiers. Sulla, a member of the Cornelia family, a very ancient, very prestigious, though poor, aristocratic clan, began to become the adversary of Marius. Various campaigns were conducted by both sides. In one of the campaigns, Sulla ended up in eastern Turkey. And he was the first Romans to meet the Parthians from Persia. And while he was on that campaign, a Chaldean astrologer prophesied that Sulla would attain supreme power and unlimited wealth and then die. And Sulla went back to Rome certain of his own supremacy. He then fought what they called a social war. By that time, in about 100 BC, the Italian states that had been conquered with Rome were demanding so vociferously that they be given citizenship so that they too could partake in the unbelievable wealth that was coming into Rome. And they rose up in rebellion. And Sulla was the one that defeated them. And in one of the great battles of Sulla in the social war, he was awarded what they call the grass crown. The grass crown was the supreme honor. It came not from the Senate. It came not from Rome. It came from the soldiers to a commander who had so distinguished himself with bravery on the field of battle that he had saved the entire legion. And they would fashion a crown out of the grasses they found around the battlefield. And they placed it on Sulla. Well, while Sulla was fighting the social war, Marius was consolidating power in Rome and seeking to strip Sulla of his honors. And Sulla was so furious that he did something unprecedented in the history of Rome. It was the one act that was the straw that broke the camel's back. He took his legions and he marched into Rome and settled things, not through the procedures of the Senate, but through force of arms. Marius fled. And then the next thing anyone knew, a king Mithridates in the east of Armenia revolted against Rome. And everyone knew that this was going to be the war of that generation. And Sulla was honored with the accolade. Marius set in motion intrigue that deprived Sulla of the honor. And more battles. Finally, Marius was temporarily neutralized, and Sulla went to the east. And even though he was outnumbered by 2 and sometimes 3 to 1, he defeated Mithridates and the massive forces of the Eastern potentate. Then he moved into Greece and he sacked Athens after laying siege. And there's a very famous line from Sulla just before the sack of Athens. The king of Athens refused to surrender. And finally, a spy told Sulla that there was a certain part of the wall that was weak. So Sulla sent his soldiers and they destroyed that part of the wall. And when that part of the wall fell, the Athenians panicked. And the Athenian king sent emissaries to Sulla, and he received them in his tent. And they said, Sulla, this is Athens. This is the great Athens. You can't destroy Athens. And Sulla said, I'm not here to take lessons about history. I am here to punish the traitors. And he moved into Athens with such ferocity that the blood flowed in the streets, and he was only persuaded to stop the carnage by some dear friends who took pity on the birthplace of democracy. And then he moved back to Italy. The Marian forces were still maneuvering. And for the second time, Sulla entered Rome. this time for good. His legions were now veterans, fiercely loyal to Sulla. His forces were overwhelming. And when he consolidated power, he enunciated what is called the proscription. And this was after a final battle with the Marian forces in front of the gates of Rome, the Battle of the Colline Gates, where when all is said and done, Sulla's forces slaughtered 50,000 Romans. I want to draw your attention to this because not only does Sulla mark the first time someone entered Rome by force, up in that any general on the outskirts of Rome lay down his arms. But the second precedent that Sulla established in his wars with Marius was fratricide. Romans fighting Romans. The 50,000 soldiers, and probably women and children, because all these armies carried lots of people. They were all Romans. They weren't the enemy. They were the compatriots. And when he entered Rome, he took control of the Senate and began the proscription. And over the next year or so, over 9,000 people were killed. Not because they were enemies of Sulla, but because they were wealthy and had land. He killed them off. He did what dictators ever before and ever since have done. He rewarded those who turned him in, even if you were a slave. So just think of how many people settled scores during the proscription. And it is said by Plutarch that sons betrayed their fathers and daughters their mothers. And the land and the wealth was distributed to the soldiers of Sulla. He proclaimed himself dictator indefinitely and governed without remorse. And then quite suddenly, about 2 years later, in about 80 BC, he relinquished the dictatorship. And one little note on the proscription that I want to add, almost forgot, but important. One of the people that he sought to kill during the proscription was the young Julius Caesar. And Caesar, only in his 20s, had caught the eye of Sulla. And he was an old man by now. He died when he was 60, so he would have been about 58 by then. He let Caesar get away. And he said famously, that Caesar, in Caesar are many Mariuses. And he was right. He then retired to his villa outside Rome with his wife and with his longtime male lover, and they enjoyed the estate. And then in 78 BC, after a bout of illness, which historians believe to be alcohol poisoning, Sulla died. And he was given the most magnificent burial in the history of Rome between its founding and the burial of Caesar Augustus. He was brought into Rome in a golden casket. The casket was placed in the temple of Jupiter. There was a public holiday for 3 days, an oratory. And he had inscribed on his gravestone his own epitaph, which said, "For every deed done by a friend, and every deed done by an enemy, I have repaid them all in full." Very unfortunately, we have almost completely lost his memoirs. That's what he wrote in the 2 years before he died. They were published, but they've been lost to history. I would have loved to have read the memoirs of Sulla. What can we learn now from Sulla about the current state of the American Republic? We can learn a number of things. One is that when a system begins to collapse, it collapses because, as Toynbee points out in his monumental study of history, it loses its elasticity to change. And therefore, problems that, when elasticity is present, can be solved through consensus, begin to deepen into crises because the polarization between the factions makes it impossible to change anything. With the exception of Obamacare, the United States has not passed any major legislation, social legislation, I think, in 30 years. And Obamacare was such a compromise that it solved very few real problems and has essentially been dismantled within a few years of its enactment. Parts of it cling on. You saw in ancient Rome the fratricide between Marius and Sulla, between the populari and the optimi, the masses and the wealthy. Each side engaging in demagoguery against the other. Look at what Trump is doing. Completely denigrating the Democrats, the press, the foreigners, any judges that disagree. That's causing polarization, the rise of hate crimes, the rise of rapes, the rise of sexual violence of all kinds, racism. All of those are on the rise. as Jung has said, barbarism is just skin deep. And the state structures, civilization, culture is the thin veneer we create to suppress those atavistic impulses, which, if not contained, will spill over into blood. Trump is ripping that apart. That's fratricide. Turning one person against another, whether it's white and black, male and female, indigenous or foreign. And then what becomes the instrument? Not civil discourse, not democratic debate, but increasing violence. You see that as Trump systematically is breaking down the rule of law and violating even the most obvious social, ethical, and cultural diplomatic norms. He just blew through the G7 with an incoherence that was almost psychotic. And then announced on the plane coming back that the next G7 is going to be at his private estate in Florida. And the White House dutifully this morning said, "Yup," in clear violation of the emolument clause of the Constitution. That's illegal. That's unconstitutional. But just like Sulla marching into Rome, Trump is so empowered that he can now act with complete disregard, knowing that the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi aren't going to do anything. The Federal Election Commission, as of yesterday, does not have enough members to even enact a quorum. We all know what happened in the 2016 election with the Russians hijacking the election with the active cooperation of the Trump organization. Do you know that there's not been a single piece of legislation passed in the last 2 years to remedy that? And we're going into the next election even more unprotected by design. That's what violence does. That's what coercion is. And then the next step, which is already being actively talked about by Trump, is that he's not going to be bound by 4-year limits. He wants to be president indefinitely. And he's got senators like Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina and others saying, we think that's a good idea. Why? Because the central ethos of the republic has been vanquished and superseded by the corporate interests and the interests of the wealthy. So that even though Trump is a buffoon, underneath it all, he is serving their interests like a slave. And that's why Naomi Klein is correct when she says that Donald Trump is not an exception. He is the exemplification of the corruption of shock capitalism. So as we contemplate Sulla, as we contemplate the parallels between the Roman Republic and the American Republic, as we consider how to respond to the presidency of Donald Trump, I end as I began. Let us not assume that we're going to have a happy ending just because somehow God loves America. Freedom, honor, justice, the integrity of the individual, and the integrity of the public commons has to be protected, sometimes with blood, with every generation, at every juncture. And therefore, the great question before the United States and before the world, as we had to determine with Adolf Hitler 75 years ago, what should we do? Who will take a stand? How do we stop the madness? How do we preserve what we all know is true and good and beautiful about human life and our civilizations? That's what this distant mirror of Alcibiades from ancient Athens and Sulla from ancient Rome challenge us to deliberate upon. And as we make our decisions, our fate will be determined. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I will turn it over to my distinguished colleague from Budapest, who's as hot as Georg and I are today. It's close to 30 degrees centigrade. And we'll have opening remarks. And then we'll open it up to our attendees. And I want all our students to speak out. And then we'll have our discussion, and then we'll close it off. Georgie?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I had a few big sighs after you finished your lecture. Another fantastic, amazing, passionate lecture of yours. Well, I must say that Sulla is not a cheerful topic, is he? But so is not Trump. And I wonder why you actually chose Sulla as a topic, as a comparison between Trump and Sulla. Do you actually think, you answer later, not right now, please, maybe he's some kind of like reincarnate form in Trump? So as I was reading Plutarch's words, I was wondering what are the attributes and the characteristics of a bad leader like Sulla, because I can't say that. In many ways you did say that he was a genius, but he was a very inhumane person. And while I was asking the question, Plutarch was saying at point 30 that when a night was now far advanced, messengers came to the camp of Sulla from Crassus to fetch supper for him and his soldiers. For after conquering the enemy, he had pursued them into Antemone, and he was encamped before that city. When therefore Sulla learned this, and also that the greater part of the enemy had been destroyed, he came to the city at the break of the day. There 3,000 of the inhabitants sent a deputation to him to sue for mercy, and he promised them safety if they would do some mischief to the rest of the enemies before coming to him. So they, trusting to his promise, attacked the rest of the people in the city, and many were slain by one another's hands. However, the survivors of both parties alike, to the number of 6,000, were collected by Sulla in the circus at Rome, and then the Senate was summoned by him to meet in the temple of Bellona, and at the same moment he himself began to speak in the Senate, and those assigned to the task began to cut to pieces the 6,000 in the circus. The shrieks of such a multitude who were being massacred in a narrow space filled the air, of course, and the senators were dumbfounded, but Sulla, with the calm and unmoved countenance with which he had begun to speak, ordered them to listen to his words and not concern themselves with what was going on outside, for it was only that some criminals were being admonished by his orders. If this doesn't make you sick, then what does? So the first thing came to me after having read this, that the characteristic of a bad leader is being totally heartless. How can you kill so many like that without even feeling anything in your heart and soul about it? Then my question to you, Jim, is that what do you think about fortune and achievement in terms of a leader like Sulla? And why I'm asking this question, because the next thing Plutarch was saying is that Sulla, he was raving about his achievements, and he gave himself a surname, the Fortunate, the Felix. And he also named two of his children, one of his, which is a son, Faustus, and the female Fausta, the auspicious and the joyful. And he kept saying that his achievements were just as important as him being fortunate. But if we consider something like that being fortunate, that would mean that the gods or the heavens just gave him a fortune without even, like a lottery win, isn't it? But I don't believe in such things, but in context of Trump and Sulla and being fortunate, what are your feelings about this point?
Well, thank you for your perspicacity here. I think you're raising two really profound issues. One is the psychosis of the military mind and to leaders who will sacrifice everything and engage in merciless acts of violence. There's maybe a difference in number, but not really in kind, between Sulla butchering all those people and a Trump who will put babies in cages. And so far, there's been a half a dozen, maybe a dozen of the kids that have died. And he ups the game and doubles down on essentially the torture of the immigrants that have sacrificed their lives to come in with complete faith, like those people in the situation with Sulla, that he was going to act, that the United States was going to act honorably. That's what we've said for 250 years. And Trump is cutting them down and is doing it with a heartlessness to children, to infants. That is shocking. There was a Harvard medical doctor that wrote an article in I think it was the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, if I remember correctly, saying there's no other conclusion but that Donald Trump is a psychopath. And a psychopath, as you rightly point out, is someone without conscience. Sulla could sit there knowing what was happening, lie about it. Those weren't criminals. Those were innocent civilians. And then butcher 9,000 Roman friends and neighbors just to get their land. during the prescription. And I think that that's what characterizes Trump. He's a psychopath. He has no conscience, as someone has said. In fact, a whole team of medical doctors have said he's a narcissistic psychopath. He cannot engage in empathy with anyone outside himself, and therefore is capable of doing everything. Now, to the question of fortune, that's very interesting. You know, one of the comments that Rick Tarnas made about the natal chart, the astrology of Donald Trump, is that what's indicated in his star chart is fortune. He's a Teflon politician. Nothing sticks. What would have brought down Obama brought down Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton told one lie about one instance with a woman, and he was impeached within like 6 weeks. Trump, I think the Washington Post has got it 13,000 lies. He's engaged in every possible sacrilege against public, racial, sexual, diplomatic discourse and behavior, and the Democrats won't impeach him. And it's highly likely that he'll steal the 2020 election like he did the 2016 election and be president indefinitely. It's now his election to lose unless the Democrats or somebody does something, which could conceivably happen. But the longer it goes, the more fortune, and remember Machiavelli, at the end of The Prince, he talks about fortuna. He says there is a mysterious quality to history, and that for some unfathomable reason that is not connected with good or evil, justice or injustice, fortuna. There goes Trump. Untouchable. And the other guy who's done it the right way all his life is vanquished and run over by a truck. Mm. And it is that fortuna, said Machiavelli, that is the ultimate arbiter of history. So no matter how powerful you think you are, or how right you think you are, ultimately the decision is taken at levels and for reasons inaccessible, he says, to the human mind. So you're raising this issue of fortune, Georgie, and you're right. Sulla all his life considered himself fortunate, and yet he was a psychopath.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I agree with all your words. I really hope that Fortuna will favor Marianne Williamson. I do believe in miracles, and it may be the case. And also, just one more point, that all the questions you were raising at the end of your lecture, I think we may find some answers to it in 2 weeks' time when we will talk about the prophet from Kelly Gibran. And I do believe that we can't really expect activity from our government. We need to be active as private citizens.
Yes.
We do have to. And that's the only way really to rise against such tyrant and psychopath like Trump and like Sulla was, and like Hitler was as well. But thank you very much. I will hand over the words to our listeners. I'm sure that they have lots to contribute as well. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Georgie. Always a pleasure. And at the end of our time here, after we get some comments from the students, I'll turn it over to you to talk about Gibran and give the date and any preliminary remarks you want to make. Okay, everyone. I see some students here. Oh, and I see Toby Terrell, John Jeanette, Myra Jackson, Eleanor, Amy Blumenshine. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Amy. Barbara Forbes, Dave McQuarrie, Diane Mark. Love to hear from any of you. Someone raise your hand. This is a hot topic. Amy, do you have anything to say? Where's Amy? I'd love to hear from Amy.
John has raised his hand, Bill.
Oh, John. Yeah, hi, John. And then a couple of the others, I'd love to hear from 4 or 5 of you before we hang up. So please step forward. John.
So apparently my Norton security had to decide whether this was a worthy enterprise. Took a second there. Hi, Jim. I wanted to make just 2 observations that came to me while you were talking about Sulla and how, and the parallels to Trump. And the first one is about revenge, which of course was Sulla's motivation to begin with. And to end up on his tombstone, I thought if Trump had heard that quote, he probably would think it was one of the greatest tombstones ever. And I remember that it was the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner when he wasn't even in the political arena yet as a candidate, and Obama was making fun of him. And
I remember that, yeah.
Had no sense of humor whatsoever. He was seething the whole time. And I swear, when you come to things like him talking about Obama at the G7, that the reason that Russia was thrown out of the G8 was because Obama was upset. He cannot get, he has not yet achieved enough revenge for just that, for just being made fun of at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, that drives his shakeup of the entire globe just to get back at Obama. He's obsessed with it. And the other comment, and then I look forward to hearing from other students, is something that Steve Bannon said. Well, just to finish up on revenge, Steve Bannon has said that if we haven't even seen the kind of revenge that Trump is capable of, that if he gets reelected, that's what his entire second term will be about. But I was also struck by Sulla having so many foot soldiers loyal to him. And with Trump, that's true as well. You mentioned Lindsey Graham. It's my understanding that when Graham flip-flopped and went from a never-Trumper to being a Trump loyalist, that his popularity in South Carolina went up by like 20 points. And so it's not just the Lindsey Grahams, it's the Trump soldiers, the MAGA hats throughout the United States, millions and millions of people who are following Trump with a kind of loyalty that is borders on what Anne Baring would call being possessed. I was reminded, in fact, I'm working on my Anne Baring paper and included the scene from Cabaret where the soldier begins to sing and everyone in the audience rises to sing with him. They're the train conductors, the administrative assistants that made Hitler's rise and destruction possible. That's what we're up against. When we talk about taking action, we're not just up against Trump. We're up against his soldiers. So those were my thoughts.
Ooh, I think you're right. And starting with the last point first, the soldiers of Sulla were so fiercely loyal that they followed him even to destroying the Republic. And that's one reason why I chose Sulla, because I wanted to point out what you're indicating. Thank you. This is going to end in violence. This is not this is not going to be a cakewalk and we're going to get rid of him. And if he wins the second election by hook and by crook, the prescription in a new form, but the vengeance will be played out. And we should make no mistake about it, that the coercive energy against the judiciary, against the press, he's pushing like Hitler did. First, it's just rhetoric. And then it becomes increasingly manifest. And then it becomes increasingly coercive. And I would be willing to predict that if Donald Trump is elected president, possibly even before, I could imagine a scenario where he continues to incite till there's real bloodshed on the streets and he declares martial law. I could see a scenario where he could take us into war against Iran to seize the administrative state and quell any opposition. And what we're seeing with what's happening at the border is internment camps. We're allowing concentration camps to be built, operated in the full light of day in the United States of America, where they're caging babies. And that violence is going to escalate. That violence is going to become more systematized. And that leads to the first point that you made, which I think is very incisive. I was watching TV during that correspondence dinner when they were shredding Trump, and he was sitting there seething. This was no joke to Trump. And I just thought, whoa, at that time I had no idea he was going to be running for president or anything else like that. But I saw one angry man. And we know enough about Trump to know that he feeds off of these negative emotions. And that vengeance, that hatred, that jealousy, that animosity, is what feeds his soul and what he's sowing and he's activating in his he's got close to 85-90% popularity in the Republican Party. And the extraordinary thing is he's got 85-90% popularity among the evangelical Christians and the Hasidic Jews. So the most fundamentally religious are the most Trumpian. So there's a very toxic mix of shadow content that's being pumped into a base that is beginning to identify it. And what's extraordinary about the base is you ask people in the Trump base, they don't think he's a racist. They don't think he's a sexist. In fact, evangelical Christians consider him to be a man of God, sent by God to protect Israel and to save the United States from the gays and the lesbians. I mean, it is extraordinary. Not only does the toxicity feed that psychic pool, but when you ask them, they have a complete denial or ignorance of the toxicity itself. And then you get caught up in righteous indignation. And that's when, Georgie, you can go out and kill 6,000 people in the stadium without remorse. And Sulla can just sit there saying, listen to my soliloquy here. We're just killing a few criminals. So that inversion of the psyche, And one other point from Jung, because remember, Jung wrote an essay, his Terry Lectures, just to take a moment on this, because what John and Georgie are bringing up is really fundamental questions, everybody. Carl Jung wrote an essay and he delivered in his Terry Lectures in Yale in 1938. And one of them was called Wotan. And what he said was emerging in the German psyche was the Teutonic god of storm. And that it was seizing. He said the German people were being seized by a malignant archetypal form. And they think it's calm weather, he said. He then, in his Terry Lectures, had been pondering, how does a people get seized by a shadow content and yet still remain completely normal? And he gave a great definition of mass hysteria. He says the people that are caught up in mass hysteria are perfectly ordinary people. They're truck drivers, they're bus drivers, they're teachers, they're business executives, they're policemen, they're soldiers. They go about their life. They go to church on Sunday. They dress up their kids. They're nice, law-abiding individuals. But because they're disconnected from themselves, and he says, most fundamentally, disconnected from nature, they can engage in activities that can only be judged insane. That's mass hysteria. Individually normal. But when they get into those stadiums with Trump, they become a mob. And that mob mentality leaves with them. And then when there's mass shootings, you know, since the beginning of this year, everyone, we're about 215 as of the last mass shooting, 215 days into 2019, and we've had 230 mass shootings. We've had mass shootings every day in the United States, and we're paralyzed. We can't even do anything about it. Most of them don't even make the news anymore. We're sacrificing our own young. That's what collective mass hysteria means. And that's why Sulla, it will end in violence. This is not going to have a happy ending. And we need to get ready for that. And I don't know what we do at this point, particularly with Nancy Pelosi refusing to impeach. But the farther it goes, the more we're feeding these mass hysterical energies in the collective psyche of a country that has been divided since the beginning by fratricide. And now is preparing itself to do it again. So it's significant. So thank you, John. Thank you very much for these comments. They're very deep and profound. Siegfried Kober.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Siegfried.
Hi, you can hear me. Okay.
I haven't seen you for some time.
Yeah,
Very good to see you.
Greetings from Austria.
Yeah.
I'm in my home. Yeah. Belgium, when you draw the picture of Sulla, something is very interesting that all his soldiers got land, and he threw out all the established families, killed many of them. And so he has got a lot of loyalty. So people, without using their heads, they were just following him. Now, if you draw the parallel to Donald Trump, I'm wondering, what do people, many millions of Americans will vote for Donald Trump during the next election? So I'm wondering, can you explain me what are they expecting for their life? What is the motivation to do this? It cannot just be irrational. So what will be the benefit? Why do they do this? With Sulla, it was quite clear because he has got the soldiers and he gave the land. He did all this. But what is the benefit?
Well, that's a very, very important question as well. And let me draw from Naomi Klein.
Okay.
She ponders this book. If you haven't read her book, No Is Not Enough, it came out last year, and it's basically trying to answer the question you're posing.
Okay.
And she gives two parts to the answer. One is that as a system collapses, and this is sort of what shock capitalism does, so that there's a crisis. The crisis is engineered by the elites in many cases. And in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, when people are disempowered, the strongman in this case divides the public and casts blame. So most of the Trump supporters are people who are losing out in the current economy.
Yeah, sure.
And a major group in that are not poor white men, but affluent, middle class, upper middle class men and women who are losing out as the economy shifts, and they want somebody to blame. So to blame it on the Mexicans or to blame it on the Muslims. So he's feeding the need to justify with a group of people who are losing power, losing wealth, losing social. For example, 30 years ago, there was no Me Too movement.
I know.
Now there's the Me Too movement, and men have to start behaving. A lot of men don't like that. And Trump is saying, I don't like it either. So there's a lot of men out there, who are with Jeffrey Epstein, who are with Trump, who want to have their way with women when they want to have their way with women, and they'll never admit it.
Okay.
But when someone like the President of the United States begins to activate it and justify it along with racism,
I see.
then all of a sudden they start to feel empowered, even though objectively they're being disempowered.
I see. Okay.
Then the second thing that Naomi Klein says, and this is just worth considering, I don't think it's the complete answer, but the second thing that she points out is that he's activating the millennial vision. Make America great again. It's what Hitler did. It's about the fatherland. Here, Germany was in complete ruins after World War I. The Versailles Treaty then gutted the Germans. And he said, it's not your fault, it's the Jews. That's what Trump is doing. It's not your fault, it's those Mexicans. It's the blacks, it's the women. And I'm going to lead you back to the promised land. You need Lebensraum. I'll buy Greenland. You need to be great again. I'm going to make America so that we can do anything we want. The parallels between the way Hitler spoke about the future of Germany and the way Trump speaks to his audiences about make America great again is the same millennial vision of a golden age that has been ripped away from us because of those Jews or those Mexicans and those foreigners. But I'm going to make it great again. I'm going to give you back the promise of a golden future. It's a complete fantasy. It's a psychotic fantasy, but it's feeding the shadow content of people who, as you say, aren't engaging in any kind of critical thinking. And that's the mob.
Okay.
The energy at a Trump rally now is becoming a mob energy. You know, he even in the rallies will point back to the press at the back of the room while he's being carried on live television. He's savaging the press, and everyone's saying, "Yeah, we hate the press. They're the enemy of the people." So it's that divide and conquer and a millennial vision coming together that is the power of fascism.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jim. I understand something.
Yeah, it's worth pondering, and it's. I think we'll close it out there. And although Stacy, if you have a comment, Stacy, we'll take one more, and then we'll talk about Kahil Gibran. Stacy.
Oh, hi, it's me. Is it me?
Oh, Laura, you were on Stacy.
I
This is
was.
Laura Madsen, everyone. She's one of our doctoral students.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Wow, this is really powerful. Very sobering. I happened to be reading through my notes from Rick Tarnas's presentation, and he talked about the Plutonic energy. And also, I was very intrigued by your comment about what Carl Jung brought in as part of our disconnect was especially from nature that he wrote in 1938. Very important to address that. And this Plutonic energy, I sort of wrote the quote down, it has to do with the drive to go to the taboo, the drive to go to that place that destroys laws and things. And he brought in that the axial age was the ascent where we were graced with principles of, we could say, right behavior or whatever, principles that hold the good, basically. And those actually this is what I understood him to say, those very principles elevated us, which caused us to disconnect, ironically. So that was a very interesting twist that I was like, whoa, those very laws that elevated us. And we could hear that in the Shanti Deva book. There was people were annoyed at it because there was this elevated kind of state with it. So I feel like this allowed us to connect. And now he said Rick Tarnas says we're in an arena of descent to redeem what was repressed below. So this whole eruption of shadow that seems to be going on, like I feel it in my personal life too. I mean, I'm from Vancouver and we live in the earthquake of all that's going on in the US, and our current prime minister is under attack for very little, doing nothing. Like your thing about, the previous president being impeached for, a little fling, which, I don't mean to minimize that, but compared to what Trump's doing.
Exactly.
And that's what's happening to our prime minister now. I mean, and the people that would replace him, it's not a good scene. So it's just like, it feels like it's ramping up. It's just, so I don't really have any advice, but I'm just thinking that's pretty amazing, that point of view of that we have lifted off. It's time to integrate shadow, and we have to somehow.
Well, you're right. And I think you're bringing out the astrological context for all of this is Pluto square Uranus, which in effect kind of revolutionary energy and chthonic Hades kinds of energy together. And
Right.
so without going into any detail, I would refer you to some of the lectures of Rick Tarnas in our Chartres Academy. They're on YouTube from, I think it was May, April, May. That's also a part of the context, is that the rise of Trump is coterminous with the rise of Pluto, the god of Hades, in the solar system. And the fact that the United States is going through what they call its Pluto return, where Pluto was on July 4th, 1776. It's now in exactly the same place, which gives it inordinate power. So the rise of Trump is coterminous with the rise of Pluto in America's birth chart. And so thank you, Laura, for that context. It's very important. We're in very complicated times.
Mm-hmm.
And how we now navigate, how we understand, how we act is critical to get right in order to save ourselves. And what's reverberating out of the United States is affecting Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It's affecting people all over the world. And it affected Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
We got a guy named Bolsonaro who is even more lunatic than Trump by many accounts. Yeah. And guess what? The Amazon's burning.
Yeah.
So we can't do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we're working through Ubiquity or we're talking as we're talking today, and we're getting out and spreading the word that this is a critical time and we need to pay attention, that's very, very important. So I notice we're out of time. So I'll turn it over to Georgie. But thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to getting any further comments by email or on our platform, the Ubiquity community platform, our platform that you can go on to after these calls to share your comments with the students. And now Georgie will tell us about our next lecture.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Nice to see you, Laura and John, again, and nice to meet you, Siegfried. Well, this is such a rich topic, Jim. We could have talked for another few hours. And while Laura, John, Siegfried, and you were talking, something was coming to my mind about the notion of self-righteousness. And this is all about Trump, isn't it? But his attitude is being reflected by other people. That's why all those people are so much of his support, isn't it? Because they feel very much the same way. Me and others, I'm better than you are, right? The superiority feeling. But anyhow, I think we really need to do something about this plague. And that's why you need to join in 2 weeks' time, exactly 2 weeks' time on Tuesday at 5 p.m. CET. We will talk about this amazing book, The Prophet. And it is a very short book. It's only around just over 110 pages, but it makes you think and feel profoundly. Yeah. This is the prose and poetry is not preaching to you. This is a universal spirituality that talks about the oneness and the unity, and it empowers you the same way. Empowers you about love, marriage, work, partnership, friendship, and lots of other beautiful things that we need to know about in order to know about ourselves, so we can counter-attack these Trump type of syndrome in the evolution of human consciousness. So please join us in 2 weeks' time, and see you later. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk in 2 weeks.